Hello there. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey into one of the most fascinating mysteries of human prehistory, a journey that will take us deep into the frozen mountains of Siberia, across the windswept plateaus of Tibet, and into the very threads of DNA that make up who we are today. We're going to explore a question that challenges everything we thought we knew about human evolution. What if our ancient cousins, the Denisovans, were far more advanced, far more capable, and far more remarkable than we've given them credit for? What if the story of human ingenuity doesn't begin and end with Homo sapiens, but includes other branches of the human family tree that developed their own sophisticated technologies, their own forms of artistry, their own solutions to the challenges of survival on a harsh and changing planet? Before we begin this slow exploration through deep time, I'd like to invite you to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us continue creating these journeys through science, history, and the mysteries that connect us all to this ancient world beneath our feet. Now, settle in. Perhaps dim the lights. Let your breathing slow, because tonight's story moves at the pace of geological time itself, unfolding layer by layer, revelation by revelation. We're not in a hurry. The Denisovans waited tens of thousands of years to reveal their secrets. We can take our time discovering them. The discovery that changed everything. The year was 2008. In a remote cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, Russian archaeologists were conducting routine excavations. They had been working at this site, called Denisova Cave, for decades. The cave had already yielded thousands of artifacts, stone tools, animal bones, evidence of human occupation stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The work was painstaking, methodical. Each layer of sediment represented a slice of time, often spanning thousands of years. The archaeologists would carefully excavate, sifting through the soil millimetre by millimetre, cataloguing every fragment they found. Most of what they found was stone flakes from tool-making, broken scrapers, discarded cores. Sometimes they found animal bones, mammoth, bison, reindeer, cave bear. Each fragment told a small part of the story of who had lived here and how they had survived. The cave itself was a remarkable place, sheltered from the worst of the Siberian winters, with a consistent temperature hovering around freezing that had proved excellent for preservation. The Russian team, led by archaeologists from the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Novosibirsk, had been systematically working through the deposits since the 1972. They had already established that the cave had an incredibly long history of human occupation, perhaps the longest continuous record of any site in northern Asia. But on one particular day, someone sifted through the sediments of layer 11 and found something that seemed unremarkable at first. A small piece of bone, just a fragment really, part of a finger bone, possibly from a child. It was tiny, weathered, and by itself would have told them almost nothing about who it had belonged to or when they had lived. The bone measured only a few centimetres in length. It was the distal phalanx, the tip segment of what appeared to be a pinky finger. The bone was dark brown, stained by minerals from the surrounding sediment. Its surface showed some weathering, but overall it was in reasonably good condition, well preserved by the cold, stable conditions inside the cave. In most circumstances, such a fragment would have been catalogued, placed in storage, and possibly forgotten. After all, finger bones alone can't tell you much. You can't determine species from a finger bone with any certainty. You can estimate age. This appeared to be from a juvenile, probably between 5 and 7 years old, but that's about it. Without a skull, or teeth, or other diagnostic skeletal elements, you're left with more questions than answers. But the Russian archaeologists had established a collaboration with a team of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. The institute, led by Svante Pääbo, had been pioneering revolutionary new techniques for extracting and analysing ancient DNA from fossils. If there was any lab in the world that might be able to get genetic information from this tiny scrap of bone, it was Pääbo's. So the finger bone was carefully packaged and shipped to Germany. What they couldn't have known, what they couldn't have imagined, was that this small scrap of ancient bone was about to rewrite the story of human evolution. At the Max Planck Institute, the bone went through a careful process of analysis. First, a tiny sample was drilled from the interior, where DNA would be best preserved, protected from contamination and degradation. The sample was then processed through a series of chemical extractions, isolating whatever fragments of DNA might still be present. Ancient DNA is incredibly fragile. After an organism dies, its DNA begins to break down almost immediately. Enzymes inside cells start tearing apart the double helix. Bacteria and fungi invade, consuming the organic material. Water seeps in, causing chemical reactions that damage the genetic code. Over time, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, the DNA fragments into smaller and smaller pieces, until eventually nothing remains but short, damaged snippets scattered through the bone matrix. Extracting usable genetic information from such degraded samples requires extreme care, sophisticated chemistry, and a bit of luck. You're looking for needles in a haystack, tiny fragments of ancient human DNA amid a soup of bacterial DNA, environmental contaminants, and chemical breakdown products. But Pabo's lab had refined their techniques to an extraordinary degree. They had ways of fishing out those precious fragments, amplifying them, sequencing them, and piecing them back together into something approaching a readable genome. They had done this successfully with Neanderthals, retrieving complete mitochondrial genomes and even substantial portions of the nuclear genome from bones tens of thousands of years old. The question was whether this finger bone from Siberia had preserved DNA at all, and if so, whether it would tell them anything interesting. The fossil was sent to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, where Svante Paabo and his team had pioneered revolutionary techniques for extracting and analyzing ancient DNA. Pabo's work had already transformed our understanding of Neanderthals. Now, he and his colleagues were about to stumble upon something even more surprising. When they sequenced the mitochondrial DNA from that finger bone, they found something strange. The genetic pattern didn't match modern humans. That wasn't particularly shocking after all. Neanderthal remains had been found in this region before, but here's where it gets interesting. The DNA didn't match Neanderthals either. In fact, the differences were profound. This individual's mitochondrial DNA was nearly twice as different from modern human DNA as Neanderthal DNA was. The genetic divergence suggested that this represented an entirely unknown branch of the human family tree, one that had split from our common ancestor with Neanderthals something like 400,000 years ago. They named this new human species after the cave where it was discovered, Denisovans. At first, the scientific community was cautious. One bone, however interesting its DNA, was not enough to declare a new human species. But then, more fragments were found. A toe bone, several teeth, a tiny chip of bone that turned out to be from a girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan, the first direct evidence of interbreeding between different human species. Each new fragment added pieces to the puzzle, and as researchers began analyzing the genomes of modern human populations, they found something remarkable. Denisovan DNA wasn't just an ancient curiosity. It was still here, still present in people living today. In fact, people from Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and nearby islands carry significant amounts of Denisovan ancestry, about 2 to 5% of their genome. Smaller amounts show up in East Asian populations, in Southeast Asians, in Native Americans. The Denisovans, it turned out, hadn't simply vanished without a trace. They had interbred with our ancestors, contributed their genes to our gene pool, and left biological legacies that persist to this day. In some cases, these legacies turned out to be extraordinarily useful adaptations that help modern populations survive in challenging environments. But who were they? What were they like? How did they live? These questions have driven a remarkable burst of scientific research over the past decade, and with each new discovery, a picture has emerged. Not a complete picture, perhaps, but an increasingly detailed sketch of a human species that was far more sophisticated than we initially imagined. The cave at the crossroads. To understand the Denisovans, we must first understand their home, or at least the place where we found most of what we know about them. Denisova Cave sits in the Anui River Valley, nestled in the foothills of the Altai Mountains in southern Siberia. It's about 100 kilometers south of the city of Biysk, in a region where Russia borders Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China. This is not a gentle landscape. The winters are brutal, with temperatures plunging far below zero. The summers are brief. The terrain is rugged, carved by glaciers and rivers over millions of years. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, this cave has been prime real estate. The cave itself is large, with multiple chambers and galleries extending deep into the limestone. The constant temperature inside, hovering around 0 degrees Celsius, has proven to be remarkably good for preserving ancient DNA, one of the key reasons we've been able to learn so much from such fragmentary remains. Russian archaeologists began systematically excavating Denisova Cave in the 1972nd and 1982nd. What they found was layer upon layer of human occupation, not just a few years or even a few centuries, but evidence of habitation spanning nearly 300,000 years. 22 distinct archaeological layers, each representing different periods, different climates, different peoples. The deepest, oldest layers date back to around 280,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. Stone tools from these layers belong to what archaeologists call the Middle Paleolithic scrapers. Points, carefully worked flakes of stone. As you move up through the layers, through time, the technology evolves. Different styles of toolmaking come and go. Some periods show more sophisticated techniques than others. But here's what makes Denisova Cave truly extraordinary. It wasn't home to just one human species. It was a crossroads, a meeting place, where at least 3 different branches of humanity lived over the course of millennia. The earliest inhabitants, based on both genetic evidence from sediments and the dating of the oldest Denisovan fossils, were Denisovans themselves. They were here first, occupying the cave as early as 300,000 years ago. The oldest Denisovan DNA recovered from cave sediments dates to about 200,000 years ago, though individual fossils suggest their presence even earlier. Then came the Neanderthals. They show up in the archaeological record around 170,000 years ago. Different groups of Neanderthals used the cave at various times, sometimes overlapping with Denisovan occupation, sometimes not. The famous Altai Neanderthal toe bone found in the cave is about 120,000 years old and has given us one of the highest quality Neanderthal genomes ever sequenced. And finally, much later, came modern humans Homo sapiens. DNA evidence from sediments indicates that our species arrived at the cave around 45,000 years ago, during the early stages of the Upper Paleolithic. But no Homo sapiens fossils have been found at the site. Their presence is known only through DNA traces in the soil and through the style of artifacts they left behind. This makes Denisova Cave unique in the world. It's the only archaeological site where we have definitive evidence that 3 different human species lived over time, and quite possibly, though, this is harder to prove at the same time. Picture it for a moment. A cold Siberian evening, perhaps 50,000 years ago. In this cave, a family of Denisovans might be preparing for the night, tending a fire, working on tools. Not far away, maybe in a neighbouring valley, a group of Neanderthals is doing the same. And somewhere else in this vast landscape, recently arrived from the south, small bands of Homo sapiens are exploring this new territory, figuring out how to survive in a climate much harsher than the Africa their ancestors left tens of thousands of years before. We know these groups encountered each other. We know because the genetic evidence is unambiguous. They didn't just coexist, they interbred. That girl we mentioned earlier, the one whose mother was a Neanderthal and father was a Denisovan, she was discovered in this cave. Her very existence proves that different human species not only met but formed relationships intimate enough to produce children. And there's more evidence of interbreeding. The Denisovan genome shows signs of Neanderthal ancestry. About 17% of it comes from an admixture event with Neanderthals that occurred far in the past. Modern human genomes carry traces of both Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, showing that our ancestors interbred with both groups. This wasn't some rare, isolated phenomenon. It happened multiple times, across wide geographic areas, over tens of thousands of years. The picture that emerges is very different from the old narrative of human evolution, the one where Homo sapiens marched triumphantly out of Africa and conquered the world, displacing or outcompeting other human species through superior intelligence or technology. Instead, we see something more complex, more nuanced, multiple human species, all of them intelligent, all of them adapted to their environments, all of them capable of culture and innovation, meeting and mingling in a world that belonged to all of them. Fragments of identity. One of the great frustrations and fascinations of studying Denisovans is how little physical evidence we have. Unlike Neanderthals, for whom we have hundreds of fossils, many of them quite complete, Denisovan remains are vanishingly rare. From Denisova Cave itself, we have only a handful of specimens. That finger bone, Denisova 3, as it's known in the scientific literature, belonging to a young female. Several teeth, Denisova 2, 4, and 8, all molars, worn and incomplete. The toe bone, Denisova 5, which turned out to be Neanderthal, not Denisovan. That small bone chip, Denisova 11, from the girl with mixed parentage, and a few additional fragments identified more recently through sophisticated protein analysis. None of these fossils, on their own, would tell us much about what Denisovans actually looked like. The bones are too fragmentary, too small. You couldn't reconstruct a face from a finger bone or a molar. But in 2019, everything changed. A research team led by scientists from China reported an extraordinary find. In 1980, before Denisovans were even known to science, a Buddhist monk had discovered a partial mandible, a lower jaw, in Baixia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau. The fossil became part of a collection at Lanzhou University, where it sat, unstudied, for 3 decades. When researchers finally analysed it in 2010, they couldn't extract ancient DNA, the preservation wasn't good enough. But they could analyse ancient proteins, which survive much longer than DNA. The protein sequences from the collagen in the jaw showed it was remarkably similar to Denisovan proteins. This jaw, dated to more than 160,000 years old, was Denisovan, and it was found on the Tibetan Plateau at an altitude of 3,280 meters above sea level. This was a revelation. It meant Denisovans weren't confined to Siberia. They had ranged across a huge swath of Asia, from the frozen mountains of southern Siberia to the high-altitude deserts of Tibet. They had adapted to radically different environments. And crucially, their presence on the Tibetan plateau suggested something profound about their adaptive capabilities, something we'll explore in much greater detail shortly. In 2025, even more exciting news emerged. Researchers proposed that the famous Harbin cranium, a remarkably well-preserved skull discovered in China in 1933, was actually Denisovan. The skull, which had been classified as a separate species, Homo longi, showed protein and mitochondrial DNA signatures that matched Denisovans. If confirmed, this would be the first relatively complete Denisovan skull ever found. The Harbin cranium is extraordinary. It has a large brain cavity, about 1,420 cubic centimeters. For comparison, the average modern human brain is about 1,350 cubic centimeters. The skull is robust, with thick bones, but also shows surprisingly modern features in some respects. It belonged to a man, probably middle-aged, who lived roughly 146,000 years ago. If this skull is Denisovan, it gives us our first real look at what they might have been like. Large-brained, certainly, strongly built, adapted to harsh climates and demanding environments. But even with these discoveries, we're still piecing together the Denisovan puzzle from frustratingly few pieces. Most of what we know about them comes not from bones, but from DNA, from the genetic traces they left in the sediments of Denisova Cave, from the portions of their genome that persist in modern human populations, and from the incredibly detailed work of geneticists who can tease out evolutionary relationships from tiny fragments of ancient genetic material. Genetics tells us that Denisovans split from the common ancestor they shared with Neanderthals around 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. After that split, both groups evolved independently. Neanderthals spreading primarily through Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans through Eastern Asia. Genetics also tells us that there wasn't just one Denisovan population. Analysis of the DNA from different Denisovan individuals at Denisova Cave shows significant genetic diversity, suggesting multiple waves of Denisovan occupation over time, possibly representing different groups or even different lineages within the broader Denisovan family. And genetics reveals something else. About 4% of the Denisovan genome comes from yet another, even more ancient human species, one that diverged from modern humans over 1 million years ago. We don't know what this species was. We haven't found their fossils, but Denisovans carried their genes, evidence of interbreeding in the deep past. The human family tree, it turns out, is not a simple branching diagram. It's a tangled web, with multiple lineages splitting apart and then reconnecting through interbreeding, carrying each other's genes forward through time. The Denisovans were part of this web, linked to Neanderthals, to Homo sapiens, to mysterious archaic populations whose names we don't yet know, the gift of the mountains. Now we come to one of the most remarkable parts of the Denisovan story, a genetic gift that has helped millions of people survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Tibetan Plateau is often called the roof of the world. It's the highest and largest plateau on the planet, with an average elevation of over 4,500 meters, that's about 14,800 feet. The air at that altitude contains significantly less oxygen than at sea level. For most people, spending time at such heights leads to altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, shortness of breath. The body responds by producing more red blood cells to carry oxygen, which can lead to dangerously thick blood, putting strain on the heart. But Tibetans, who have lived on this plateau for thousands of years, don't suffer from these problems. They have evolved unique physiological adaptations that allow them to thrive in the thin air of high altitudes. Instead of producing excessive amounts of hemoglobin, their bodies maintain relatively normal hemoglobin levels, avoiding the health complications that plague most visitors to high altitudes. For years, scientists knew that this adaptation had a genetic basis. They could see it in the differences between Tibetans and lowland populations like the Han Chinese, with whom Tibetans share recent common ancestry. But the exact genetic mechanism remained mysterious until 2014. That year, a team of researchers led by Rasmus Nielsen and Emilia Huerta Sanchez published a groundbreaking study. They had sequenced a gene called EPAS, one in 40 Tibetan individuals and 40 Han Chinese individuals. EPAS, one produces a protein involved in the body's response to low oxygen. It's a key regulator of how cells adapt to hypoxia. What they found was stunning. The Tibetan version of EPAS-1 was radically different from the versions found in almost all other modern human populations. It had a unique haplotype, a specific combination of genetic variants that was extremely rare elsewhere. When they searched databases of human genomes from around the world, they could find this variant in only 2 Han Chinese individuals out of hundreds tested. But when they compared the Tibetan EPAS-1 gene to the genome of that Denisovan individual from Siberia, they found an almost perfect match. The genetic variant that allows Tibetans to live at extreme altitudes didn't arise through new mutations in their own ancestors. It came from Denisovans. Sometime in the past, probably between 30,000 and 50,000 years ago, the ancestors of Tibetans interbred with Denisovans. They inherited this particular version of the EPAS-1 gene, and when their descendants moved onto the Tibetan Plateau and began living at extreme altitudes, this Denisovan gene turned out to be extraordinarily beneficial. Natural selection favored individuals who carried it. They had fewer health problems. They had more surviving children, and over many generations, the frequency of this Denisovan variant increased until it became the dominant version in Tibetan populations. Today, nearly all Tibetans carry it. It's one of the strongest signals of natural selection ever detected in human populations, evidence that this gene has been critical for Tibetan survival at high altitudes. The Sherpa people of Nepal, famous for their extraordinary abilities at high altitude, share this same genetic heritage. They too carry the Denisovan EPAS1 variant at very high frequencies. Studies have confirmed that this variant is associated with lower hemoglobin levels in Sherpa individuals, just as it is in Tibetans, helping them avoid altitude sickness and the health complications associated with excessive red blood cell production. But here's what makes this discovery so profound. It means that Denisovans themselves almost certainly had this high-altitude adaptation. They must have lived at high elevations, faced the challenge of hypoxia, and evolved a genetic solution. That makes sense given the Shahe jaw found on the Tibetan plateau, clear evidence that Denisovans inhabited this region. In fact, researchers now believe that Denisovans may have been the first humans to successfully colonize the Tibetan plateau. They were there long before Homo sapiens, thriving in an environment that would be deadly for most mammals. Their genetic adaptation to altitude was so effective that when modern humans later moved into the region, the only way they could successfully adapt was by acquiring the Denisovan gene through interbreeding. Think about what this means. Modern humans, often considered the most adaptable and innovative of all human species, couldn't simply evolve their own solution to high-altitude life. The mutation rate wasn't fast enough. Natural selection would take too long. Instead, they took a shortcut. They acquired a ready-made solution from Denisovans, a sophisticated genetic adaptation that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years. This phenomenon is called adaptive introgression. It's when one species acquires beneficial traits from another species through interbreeding. It's not unique to humans, we see it in other animals too. But the EPAS1 gene is one of the clearest and most important examples in human evolution. And it tells us something crucial about Denisovans. They weren't some primitive or less advanced cousin of modern humans. They were sophisticated, adaptive, and capable of surviving in environments that would challenge any species. They developed genetic solutions to problems that modern humans couldn't solve on their own. In fact, recent research suggests that the Denisovan contribution to high-altitude adaptation may be even more extensive than just EPAS1. Other genes involved in oxygen regulation, cardiovascular function, and blood vessel formation also show signs of Denisovan ancestry in Tibetan populations. The full story of how Denisovan genes helped humans colonize the Tibetan plateau is still being written, but it's clear that without this genetic inheritance, modern Tibetans and Sherpa might not be able to live where they do today. Artists in stone and bone. When we think about prehistoric humans, we often imagine crude stone tools, simple shelters, and a life dominated by the basic necessities of survival. But the archaeological evidence from Denisova Cave tells a very different story, one of sophistication, artistry, and technical skill that rivals anything produced by early Homo sapiens. In 2008, archaeologists working in Layer 11 of the East Chamber made a discovery that challenged many assumptions about Denisovan capabilities. Carefully buried in the sediments, they found a bracelet, but this was no simple ornament. It was made of chlorite, a dark green stone with beautiful natural banding. The bracelet had been carefully shaped and polished to a smooth finish. Most remarkably, it had a hole drilled through it, a precisely placed perforation, clearly made with sophisticated tools and techniques. The chlorite itself was not local to the cave. The nearest known source is about 200 kilometers away, suggesting that either the stone was transported over a considerable distance or that Denisovans had a far-ranging trade network. Either way, it speaks to planning, to the deliberate selection of materials for their aesthetic properties, not just their practical uses. The manufacturing technique used to create this bracelet is what really stunned researchers. The hole appears to have been made using a rotation-based drilling technology, something that wasn't supposed to appear in human cultures until much later, during the Neolithic period thousands of years later. The smooth, polished surface suggests hours of patient work, probably using leather and fine-grained abrasives to achieve the lustrous finish. When this bracelet was first dated, estimates placed it at 40,000 to 50,000 years old, already breathtaking for its sophistication, but more recent analysis suggests it might be even older, perhaps 65,000 to 70,000 years old. If confirmed, this would push back the timeline for such advanced craftsmanship by tens of thousands of years. Professor Mikhail Shunkov, who leads the excavations at Denisova Cave, has suggested that the technical sophistication of this bracelet actually exceeds that of early Homo sapiens artifacts from the same period. The precision of the drilling, the quality of the polish, the careful selection of the stone, these all speak to a level of skill and aesthetic sensibility that we typically associate with much later periods of human cultural evolution. But the bracelet is not alone. From the same archaeological layers come pendants made from animal teeth carefully shaped, drilled, and polished. Beads fashioned from bone and mammoth ivory, a ring carved from marble, and most spectacularly, beads made from ostrich eggshell, which would have had to be transported from considerably warmer regions far to the south, again suggesting extensive trade networks or seasonal migration patterns. Each of these items represents not just technical skill, but something more. They represent art, aesthetics, personal adornment, the creation of beautiful objects that served no immediate survival function but that held meaning for their creators, social meaning, personal meaning, perhaps spiritual meaning. In the same layers, researchers found bone tools of remarkable refinement, awls for piercing leather or bark, smoothers for working hides, pressure tools for manufacturing delicate stone blades. Each tool shows evidence of careful manufacture and extensive use. And then there's the needle. In 2016, excavations in Layer 11, point 2 of the main chamber, uncovered a 7-centimeter long sewing needle made from bird bone. The needle has a drilled eye, a tiny, precisely placed hole that thread could pass through. The craftsmanship is so fine that it rivals needles from much later periods. The preservation is extraordinary. You can see the smooth, polished surface, worn smooth by use. This needle is currently dated to approximately 50,000 years ago, making it the oldest known needle in the world. There is another possible needle from South Africa that might be older, dating to about 61,000 years ago, but its identification as a needle is less certain. What does a needle tell us? It tells us about clothing, not just animal hides draped over the body, but tailored garments, clothing carefully sewn to fit, with seams and perhaps decoration. In the brutal cold of Ice Age Siberia, well-fitted clothing would have been a matter of life and death. The needle suggests that Denisovans had solved this challenge with impressive engineering. But who made these objects? This is where things get complicated and fascinating. The bone needle, the bracelet, the pendants, they all come from Layer 11, which dates to roughly 43,000 to 50,000 years ago. The youngest known Denisovan fossil from the cave dates to between 52,000 and 76,000 years ago. Modern humans show up in the DNA record around 45,000 years ago. So we have a period where multiple human species might have been present in the region, and sophisticated artifacts that could, theoretically, have been made by any of them. For a long time, archaeologists assumed that such advanced technology, bone needles, jewelry, symbolic artifacts, could only have been made by Homo sapiens. That was the dominant narrative. Modern humans were the innovators, the artists, the symbolic thinkers, while Neanderthals and other archaic humans were stuck in simpler, more primitive cultural patterns. But that narrative has been crumbling for years. We know now that Neanderthals created art, used pigments, wore jewelry, and developed their own sophisticated technologies. And the evidence from Denisova Cave suggests that Denisovans did too. Dr. Katarina Duca and Professor Tom Hyam, who led much of the chronological analysis of Denisova Cave, have argued that the most parsimonious explanation, the simplest interpretation that fits all the evidence, is that Denisovans made these artifacts. They were present at the site when these objects were deposited. No Homo sapiens fossils or clear Homo sapiens DNA has been found in the cave layers where these artifacts occur. The artifacts show continuity with earlier Middle Paleolithic traditions present in layers that are definitely Denisovan. Of course, we can't be absolutely certain. Modern humans were in the broader Altai region by this time. The Ust-Ishim fossil, a Homo sapiens individual, dates to about 45,000 years ago and was found in western Siberia, so it's theoretically possible that early modern humans visited Denisova Cave and left behind these artifacts without leaving any fossil traces or detectable DNA. But here's what we can say with confidence. Even if modern humans made some of these later artifacts, there are earlier layers at Denisova Cave with sophisticated bone tools and crafted objects that are unambiguously associated with Denisovan occupation. The technological tradition represented by these artifacts shows clear continuity over time. It didn't suddenly appear when modern humans arrived. It evolved gradually, building on earlier innovations. This suggests that Denisovans were more than capable of developing sophisticated technology independently. They didn't need to learn from or copy Homo sapiens. They were innovators in their own right. Consider what it takes to make a bracelet like the one found at Denisova Cave. You need to recognize that certain stones have aesthetic properties, color, translucence, texture. You need to envision the finished object before it exists. You need to develop drilling technology, probably using a rotating shaft with abrasive powder. You need patience, hours and hours of careful work. And you need a social context where such objects are valued, where they convey status or meaning or identity. All of this requires abstract thinking, planning, fine motor control, and a complex social life. These are the hallmarks of behavioral modernity, the suite of cognitive and cultural traits that we once thought was unique to Homo sapiens. The Denisovans had them too. A brain built for complexity. If Denisovans could create sophisticated jewelry and finely crafted tools, what does that tell us about their brains, their minds, their cognitive capabilities? Unfortunately, with so few fossils, we can't directly measure most Denisovan brain anatomy, but the few clues we have are suggestive. The Harbin cranium, if it is indeed Denisovan, as recent analysis suggests, has an internal volume of about 1,420 cubic centimeters. That's well within the range of modern human brain size, and actually a bit larger than the average. The skull of the Jinnah Shan female, another specimen that has been tentatively linked to Denisovans, has an even larger brain, about 1,330 cubic centimeters, remarkably large for a female individual. Brain size alone doesn't tell us everything about intelligence. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, slightly larger than those of modern humans, yet we don't think they were necessarily more intelligent. Brain structure, organization, and connectivity matter as much as or more than raw size. But large brains are expensive. They require tremendous amounts of energy, about 20% of the body's total energy budget in modern humans. Natural selection doesn't favor larger brains unless there's a good reason. That reason, in primates, is usually social complexity. Large brain species tend to be ones with complex social structures, extensive social learning, and behaviors that require flexible, creative problem solving. The fact that Denisovans had brains comparable in size to ours suggests they faced similar cognitive demands, and the archaeological evidence supports this. The creation of personal ornaments, the development of sophisticated bone-working techniques, the ability to plan and execute complex multi-step manufacturing processes, all of these behaviors require cognitive abilities that, in modern humans, correlate with areas of the brain involved in working memory, sequential planning, and manual dexterity. There's another line of evidence that's more speculative but intriguing. Modern people with some Denisovan ancestry, particularly those from Melanesia and parts of Southeast Asia, don't show any obvious cognitive deficits compared to populations without Denisovan ancestry. In fact, some researchers have suggested that certain Denisovan genes that were retained in modern populations might have been adaptive, offering benefits in immune function, metabolism, or even brain development. One recent study found that a variant of a gene called NOVA1, which is involved in brain development, shows signatures of adaptive introgression from denisovans in modern humans. This gene affects the formation of neuronal connections, the synapses that allow neurons to communicate with each other. The denisovan variant appears to have been beneficial enough that natural selection favored it in populations where it was present. If denisovan genes could enhance modern human brain function, it stands to reason that those genes were doing something useful in denisovans themselves. We can also look at the cultural record. The bracelet, the needle, the pendants, these aren't just tools. They're cultural artifacts that likely had meanings beyond their immediate function. A bracelet doesn't help you hunt or gather food. It's a symbol. It says something about the person wearing it, their status, their group membership, their aesthetic preferences. The creation and use of symbolic artifacts is deeply tied to language and abstract thought. You can't really have a symbolic culture without a way to communicate about meaning, to teach the next generation what symbols represent, to negotiate the social rules around who can wear what and when. We don't know if denisovans had language in the same sense that modern humans do. We don't have any direct evidence, but the archaeological record makes it hard to imagine that they didn't have some form of complex communication. How else do you teach someone to make a bracelet using rotation-based drilling? How do you establish and maintain trade networks that span hundreds of kilometers? How do you negotiate interbreeding with other human species? There's an unfortunate tendency in popular discussions of human evolution to rank extinct human species along a scale from primitive to advanced, with Homo sapiens sitting triumphantly at the top. But this is a deeply misleading framework. Evolution doesn't work toward an endpoint. It's not a ladder with humans at the top rung. Different species evolve different solutions to the problems of survival and reproduction in their particular environments. Denisovans evolved solutions that allowed them to thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth, from the frozen mountains of Siberia to the oxygen-thin heights of the Tibetan Plateau. They developed sophisticated technologies. They created art. They had complex social lives. Were they as cognitively advanced as Homo sapiens? We can't definitively answer that question with the evidence we have, but they were almost certainly far more advanced than we've traditionally given them credit for. The old image of archaic humans as shambling, brutish cousins of modern humans doesn't fit the facts. Denisovans were capable, intelligent, and adaptable. If we had met them, if bands of early Homo sapiens encountered Denisovan groups in Ice Age Asia, we might not have seen them as fundamentally different from ourselves. Different, yes, in appearance and culture, but recognizably human, recognizably kin, masters of ice and sky. One of the most remarkable things about Denisovans is the sheer range of environments they successfully inhabited. From the evidence we have limited, though it is, they adapted to conditions that would challenge any species. Let's start with Denisova Cave itself. The Altai Mountains of southern Siberia are not a forgiving landscape. Winters are long and brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping to minus 30 or 40 degrees Celsius. Even in summer, the nights can be cold. Snow can fall in any month. Game animals are present, but not in the abundance found in more temperate regions. Plant foods are scarce. To survive here, you need sophisticated survival strategies. Fire is essential, not just for warmth, but for cooking, for keeping predators away, for extending your active hours into the dark winter evenings. You need well-made clothing, as we've discussed, fitted garments that trap body heat and keep out the wind. You need shelter, either natural caves like Denisova, or constructed shelters insulated against the cold. Archaeological evidence shows that Denisovans had all of these. They maintained fires in the cave. We find charcoal layers throughout the Denisovan occupation periods. They made bone needles and worked leather, suggesting tailored clothing. They lived in the cave year-round, not just seasonally, meaning they had strategies for winter survival. But they weren't confined to these mountains. The Shahe mandible found on the Tibetan Plateau shows that Denisovans also lived at extreme altitudes, in a completely different kind of harsh environment. The plateau sits at elevations where the air contains 40% less oxygen than at sea level. Temperatures swing wildly between day and night. Vegetation is sparse. Ultraviolet radiation is intense. The EPAS1 gene we discussed earlier was clearly an adaptation to these conditions, but there may have been others. Recent analysis of Denisovan genes that have been retained in modern Tibetan populations has identified several other candidates for altitude adaptation, including genes involved in blood vessel function, oxygen transport, and energy metabolism. The full suite of Denisovan adaptations to high altitude may have been even more extensive than we currently understand. And then there's the distribution of Denisovan DNA in modern populations. The highest frequencies are found in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, Bougainville, and surrounding islands. These are tropical regions, lowland forests and coastal environments nothing like the frozen mountains of Siberia or the high deserts of Tibet. How did Denisovan DNA get there? The most likely explanation is that Denisovans themselves ranged across a huge swath of Asia, from Siberia in the north to Southeast Asia, and perhaps even Indonesia in the south. As modern humans migrated through these regions, they encountered Denisovan populations and interbred with them. The modern Melanesian populations that carry high levels of Denisovan ancestry are descended from these admixed groups. This geographic range is staggering. We're talking about a distance of thousands of kilometers across radically different climate zones and ecosystems. Denisovans, it seems, were not specialized for one particular environment. They were generalists, capable of adapting to cold mountains, high-altitude plateaus, temperate forests, and possibly tropical lowlands. This adaptive flexibility is one of the hallmarks of human success. Homo sapiens is sometimes called the ultimate generalist because of our ability to live in virtually any terrestrial environment, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to desert. We've traditionally thought of this adaptability as uniquely human, something that set us apart from other species. But Denisovans had it too. They weren't bound to a single ecological niche. They could learn, innovate, and adjust their behaviors to suit new challenges. This is sophisticated, flexible intelligence in action. Consider what it takes to move from a cold mountain environment to a high-altitude plateau. You can't just walk there and expect to survive. The physical challenges are profound. You need the genetic adaptations we've discussed, but you also need cultural knowledge where to find food, where to find water, how to protect yourself from the elements, what plants are safe to eat, what game animals are available. This kind of knowledge has to be learned and passed down. It requires social learning, the ability to teach and to learn from others. It requires memory and planning. And it suggests that Denisovan groups maintained connections across large geographic areas, that they had migration routes and seasonal movements, that they shared information across generations. There's even tantalizing evidence, though it's controversial, that Denisovans may have made sea crossings. The presence of Denisovan DNA in Melanesian populations, combined with what we know about sea levels during the Pleistocene, raises the possibility that Denisovans crossed Wallace's Line, the major biogeographic boundary between Asia and Australasia. During glacial periods, sea levels were lower and some land bridges existed, but there would still have been significant water barriers. If Denisovans did cross these barriers, it would suggest they had some form of watercraft, not necessarily sophisticated boats, but at least rafts or simple vessels capable of crossing short stretches of ocean. This is speculative. We have no direct evidence of Denisovan seafaring, but it's an intriguing possibility that would add another dimension to their adaptability. What's clear is that Denisovans were not stay-at-home homebodies. They moved, explored, and colonized new territories over hundreds of thousands of years. They faced the challenges of diverse environments and found ways to thrive. And, in at least one case, the Tibetan Plateau, they developed an adaptation so successful that modern humans essentially couldn't compete without borrowing it through interbreeding, the web of kinship. One of the most profound revelations of Denisovan research has been what it teaches us about interbreeding among human species. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. Different human lineages didn't just coexist, they interbred, and they did so frequently enough to leave lasting genetic signatures. We've already mentioned the girl from Denisova Cave, whose mother was a Neanderthal and father was a Denisovan. Her discovery in 2018 made headlines around the world because she was direct, tangible proof of hybridization between species. But she wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a broader pattern. The Denisovan genome shows that Denisovans interbred with Neanderthals at multiple points in their history. About 17% of the Denisovan genome sequenced from Denisova Cave comes from an earlier admixture with Neanderthals, an event that probably happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, long before the two species met again at the cave. The fact that this Neanderthal ancestry is present suggests that the two species encountered each other and interbred on multiple occasions as they spread across Eurasia. Denisovans also interbred with modern humans, and again, this happened multiple times and in different places. The clearest evidence comes from Melanesian populations, who carry significant Denisovan ancestry, about 2 to 5% of their genome, but genetic analysis suggests there were at least 2 separate admixture events, possibly more, that contributed Denisovan DNA to different modern human populations. One admixture event, probably occurring in mainland Asia, somewhere between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, introduced Denisovan genes into the ancestors of modern Asian, Melanesian, and Australian Aboriginal populations. A second, later event, possibly as recent as 15,000 to 30,000 years ago, contributed additional Denisovan ancestry specifically to Melanesian lineages. There's even evidence of admixture between Denisovans and an even more archaic human species, one that split from the modern human lineage over 1 million years ago. About 4% of the Denisovan genome appears to come from this ancient, unknown hominin. We don't know who they were or where they lived, but their genes survived in Denisovans and, through Denisovans, in some modern humans. What does all this interbreeding tell us? First, it tells us that these different human species were biologically compatible enough to produce viable, fertile offspring. The genetic differences between Denisovans, Neanderthals, and modern humans were significant. They had been evolving separately for hundreds of thousands of years, but not so great that they couldn't successfully reproduce when they met. Second, it tells us that when different human groups encountered each other, they didn't always compete violently for resources or territory. At least sometimes, they formed relationships. They had children together. Those children survived, and themselves had offspring, carrying forward genetic contributions from both parent species. This paints a picture of human prehistory that's far more complex and nuanced than the old out of Africa and conquer narrative. Yes, modern humans did eventually spread across the world and become the sole surviving human species. But along the way, there was mixing, blending, exchange of genes, and quite possibly exchange of cultural knowledge as well. Third, it tells us that hybridization was sometimes adaptive, not just neutral, but actually beneficial. The EPAS1 gene is the clearest example. Modern humans acquired this gene from Denisovans, and it proved crucial for high-altitude adaptation. But there are likely others. Researchers have identified numerous Denisovan genes that show signatures of positive selection in modern populations, suggesting they offered some advantage. Some of these are related to immune function. Ancient human species like Denisovans had different immune systems that had evolved in response to different pathogens. When modern humans interbred with them, we acquired new immune genes, a kind of vaccination against diseases we hadn't encountered before. This immunological booster shot may have helped modern humans survive in new environments with new disease challenges. Other retained Denisovan genes are involved in skin pigmentation, metabolism, brain development, and other functions. Each one tells a small part of the story of how interbreeding shaped modern human evolution. But hybridization wasn't always beneficial. Many Denisovan genes that entered the modern human gene pool were later eliminated by natural selection, suggesting they were neutral or slightly harmful in modern human genetic backgrounds. The fact that some genes persisted while others were removed shows that natural selection was actively sorting through the genetic contributions from different species, keeping what was useful and discarding what wasn't. There's also the question of social and cultural interaction. For interbreeding to occur, different human groups had to meet in contexts that allowed for relatively peaceful interaction and the formation of relationships. Was this common or rare? Did Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans recognize each other as potential mates, or were these encounters occasional accidents of proximity? We can't know for certain, but the frequency of hybridization events, multiple episodes, in different places, over tens of thousands of years, suggests that it wasn't extraordinarily rare. Perhaps when different human groups encountered each other, interbreeding was one of several possible outcomes, along with avoidance, competition, or cooperation. The girl from Denisova Cave, with her mixed ancestry, represents something profound. She was the child of parents from two different species, but she existed. She grew up, at least to adolescence. Her very presence in the cave suggests she was cared for, that she was part of a social group. She wasn't rejected or abandoned because of her mixed heritage. What was her life like? Did she identify more with one parent's group than the other? Did she move between groups? Did she face any special challenges or enjoy any special advantages because of her unique genetics? We'll never know the answers to these questions, but asking them reminds us that these weren't just genetic mixing events in an abstract sense. They were human stories, lives lived, children raised, relationships formed, and through those relationships, the genetic legacy of Denisovans has survived into the present day. Hundreds of thousands of years after the last Denisovan died, their genes continue to live on in modern human populations, still performing useful functions, still helping people adapt to challenging environments. In a very real sense, the Denisovans aren't truly extinct. They're part of us, rewriting the story. For most of the 20th century, the story of human evolution was told as a straightforward progression. Ancient, primitive ancestors giving way to more advanced forms, culminating in Homo sapiens as the pinnacle of cognitive and cultural development. Other human species were viewed as evolutionary dead ends, less successful competitors who couldn't keep up with our superior capabilities. This narrative had a certain appeal. It was simple. It placed modern humans at the center of the story, and it seemed to explain why we're the only humans left. We outcompeted everyone else because we were smarter, more adaptable, more innovative. But this narrative was always too simplistic, and discoveries like the Denisovans have completely shattered it. The picture that's emerging from decades of paleogenetic and archaeological research is far more interesting and far more complex. There wasn't one line of human evolution leading inevitably to us. There were multiple human species, multiple lineages, coexisting across Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Each evolved their own adaptations, their own technologies, their own solutions to the challenges of survival. Neanderthals developed sophisticated tool technologies, used pigments and created art, cared for their injured and elderly, and had complex social structures. We used to think they were dim-witted brutes. Now we know they were intelligent, capable, and culturally complex. Denisovans, as we've explored tonight, were similarly sophisticated. They created jewelry and bone tools of remarkable refinement. They adapted to diverse and challenging environments, from Arctic Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau. They had large brains and, presumably, the cognitive capabilities that go along with them. And they interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans, contributing genes that are still beneficial today. There are even more human species in the fossil record from this period. Homo floresiensis, the so-called Hobbit of Flores Island, a small-bodied human that survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago. Homo luzonensis from the Philippines, known from fossils dated to 67,000 years ago. Homo naledi from South Africa, a species with an unusual mix of primitive and advanced features that may have survived until 230,000 years ago, overlapping with early Homo sapiens. Each of these species represented a different experiment in being human. Different body sizes, different brain sizes, different adaptations to different environments, and for a long time, they coexisted. The world of 100,000 years ago was a world of many human species, not just one. So why are we the only ones left? The honest answer is, we don't fully know. Climate change certainly played a role. The Pleistocene was a time of dramatic environmental fluctuations, ice ages and interglacials, with sea levels and vegetation zones shifting constantly. Species adapted to particular environments would have faced challenges as those environments changed or disappeared. Competition with Homo sapiens probably also played a role, though perhaps not in the way we once imagined. We didn't necessarily hunt other human species to extinction or defeat them in direct violent conflict. More likely, modern humans had certain advantages, perhaps in population size, perhaps in social organization, perhaps in specific technologies that allowed us to gradually outcompete other species for resources over thousands of years. But outcompete doesn't mean superior in all ways. It means slightly more successful at having surviving offspring in particular circumstances. Denisovans had adaptations that in some environments were probably superior to those of Homo sapiens. But in the long run, the balance tipped in our favor, and we became more numerous while they became rarer. And then there's interbreeding. To some extent, other human species didn't go extinct, they were absorbed. Their genes, their adaptations, became part of the modern human gene pool. The Denisovans as a distinct population disappeared, but Denisovan DNA survived, incorporated into our genome. In this sense, they weren't outcompeted and replaced. They were assimilated and transformed. This forces us to reconsider what we mean by human success and human exceptionalism. Modern humans aren't successful purely because of our own innovations and adaptations. We're successful in part because we borrowed genes from other species, genes that gave us immune system improvements, altitude adaptation, cold adaptation, and probably other benefits we haven't yet identified. Our success is built on a foundation that includes contributions from multiple human species. We're not a pure lineage that triumph through sheer superiority. We're a hybrid, a mixture, carrying forward the adaptive solutions developed by different branches of the human family tree. This should make us more humble about our place in nature. We're not separate from other species, not elevated above them by some fundamental cognitive superiority. We're part of a diverse family, and we owe some of our most important survival traits to the relatives we once thought of as primitive or archaic. It should also make us curious about what we lost. When Denisovans disappeared as a distinct population, what knowledge went with them? What cultural traditions, what stories, what ways of understanding the world? We'll never know. But it's a loss worth contemplating. The Denisovans were different from us, but they were also kin. They were human in all the ways that matter: intelligent, creative, social, capable of love and grief and wonder. The fact that we interbred with them, that we carry their genes, is testament to that fundamental kinship. The vanishing. Somewhere between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, Denisovans disappeared from the archaeological record. The last clear evidence of their presence DNA from sediments in Denisova Cave dates to around 50,000 years ago, though some researchers suggest they may have survived in remote areas for longer. What happened to them? Where did they go? The simple answer is that they went extinct. Their population dwindled until there were no more Denisovans left as a distinct group. But the processes that led to their extinction are complex and probably multifactorial. Climate change during the late Pleistocene was dramatic. The world was transitioning from one glacial period into an interglacial. Temperatures were warming, ice sheets were retreating, and ecosystems were shifting. In Siberia, the mammoth steppe, the vast grassland ecosystem that had supported large herds of megafauna, was being replaced by forests. For people adapted to hunting mammoth, bison, and other large game on open terrain, this would have been a significant challenge. The Tibetan Plateau would have experienced its own climate shifts. While the Denisovans there had adaptations for altitude, Changes in temperature and precipitation could still have affected the availability of food and water, making survival more difficult. Competition with other human species, particularly Homo sapiens, likely played a role as well. Modern humans were expanding their range during this period, moving into northern Asia and eventually reaching Australia by about 50,000 years ago. As modern human populations grew and spread, they would have competed with Denisovans for the same resources: game animals, plant foods, good shelter locations. This competition might not have been direct or violent. It could have been simply a matter of modern humans being slightly more efficient hunters, or having slightly larger social networks that allowed for better information sharing, or having more sophisticated long-distance weapons. Small advantages, compounded over thousands of years, can lead to large differences in population success. There's also the question of population size. Genetic analysis suggests that Denisovan populations were never very large. Low population numbers make a species vulnerable to extinction from random events: a harsh winter, a disease outbreak, a local failure of game animals. Small populations are also more vulnerable to inbreeding, which reduces genetic diversity and can lead to the accumulation of harmful mutations. If Denisovan populations were scattered across Asia in relatively small, isolated groups, they might have gone extinct at different times in different places. One group disappears here, another there, until eventually none are left. This kind of gradual, scattered extinction is harder to pinpoint in the archaeological record than a single dramatic collapse. Interbreeding with modern humans may also have played a role in Denisovan extinction. If Denisovan populations were small and modern human populations were growing, it's possible that Denisovans were gradually absorbed into the larger Homo sapiens population through interbreeding. Their distinct identity would have been lost, but their genes would have survived. This is sometimes called extinction by assimilation. It's not that Denisovans were killed off or outcompeted, it's that they mated with modern humans. Their offspring mated with modern humans, and over generations, the Denisovan genetic contribution became more and more diluted until there were no individuals who could be identified as distinctly Denisovan. In this scenario, the Denisovans didn't die out. They merged with us. Their disappearance as a separate group is less like extinction and more like absorption. Whatever the exact cause is, by about 30,000 years ago, Denisovans as a distinct population were gone. Homo sapiens continued to spread and diversify. Neanderthals persisted in Europe for a bit longer, but they too were extinct by about 40,000 years ago, perhaps earlier in some regions. By the time agriculture began around 12,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was the only human species left, but the Denisovan legacy endured, in the genes of Tibetans and Sherpa, in the immune systems of Southeast Asians, in the metabolic adaptations of Melanesians, and in the DNA of anyone with recent Asian or Oceanian ancestry, carrying fragments of Denisovan chromosomes forward into the present. When we mourn the loss of extinct species, we usually think in terms of biological diversity, unique adaptations, unique ways of being that are now gone forever. The extinction of Denisovans is a loss in that sense. Whatever made them distinct, their particular cognitive styles, their cultural traditions, their ways of understanding and interacting with their environment, is lost to us now. But there's also a sense in which they're still present, not as ghosts or memories, but as a living part of human biology. Every person who carries Denisovan DNA is, in a small way, keeping them alive. The adaptive innovations they developed over hundreds of thousands of years continue to function, continue to help people survive and thrive. This is an unusual kind of immortality, but it's real nonetheless. The Denisovans, though extinct as a species, persist as a genetic legacy woven into the human family. Questions without answers. Despite more than a decade of intense research since their discovery, Denisovans remain enigmatic. For every question we've answered, new ones have emerged, and some of the most fundamental questions about them are still unresolved. We don't know what they looked like. The few fossil fragments we have are too incomplete to reconstruct their appearance with confidence. If the Harbin skull is Denisovan, It suggests they had large, robust skulls with thick brow ridges and broad faces. But that's one specimen, and we don't know how representative it is. Did all Denisovans look similar, or was there significant variation? Were they taller or shorter than modern humans on average? What color was their skin, their hair, their eyes? DNA analysis has provided some clues. The Denisovan genome suggests they likely had dark skin, brown eyes, and dark hair. But these are educated guesses based on genetic variants we understand in modern humans. The actual phenotype, the visible physical characteristics, could have been quite different. We don't know how many distinct Denisovan populations there were. The genetic evidence suggests considerable diversity, with different Denisovan groups that were as genetically distinct from each other as modern human populations from different continents. Were these separate species within the Denisovan lineage, or just divergent populations of a single variable species? And how much contact did they have with each other? We don't know the full extent of their geographic range. We know they were in Siberia and on the Tibetan Plateau. Genetic evidence strongly suggests they ranged across much of Asia, probably into Southeast Asia, and possibly even into Oceania. But we haven't found fossils from most of these regions. There could be Denisovan remains sitting in museum collections, misidentified or unstudied. Or there could be entire Denisovan populations in regions we haven't searched yet. We don't know whether they had language in the modern sense. They almost certainly had some form of complex communication. Their cultural achievements suggest as much. But did they have fully recursive grammar? Could they discuss abstract concepts, tell stories about the past, plan for the distant future? These are questions we may never be able to answer definitively. We don't know how they related to other human species they encountered. Were meetings between Denisovans and Neanderthals friendly, hostile, neutral? When Denisovans and modern humans interbred, was it within the context of stable relationships or brief encounters? Did hybrid individuals face challenges in either parent group, or were they accepted? Did different human species trade with each other, share information, cooperate in hunts? We don't know the full extent of their technological achievements. The artifacts from Denisova Cave are impressive, but they may represent just a fraction of what Denisovans were capable of. Did they have more sophisticated technologies that haven't been preserved in the archaeological record? Musical instruments? Boats? Complex traps? Astronomical observations? We simply don't know. We don't know their cultural practices, their belief systems, their art and music. The jewellery and decorative objects suggest some form of aesthetic sense and possibly symbolic thinking. But what did these symbols mean to them? Did they have rituals, ceremonies, origin stories? How did they conceptualize their place in the world? These are frustrating gaps in our knowledge, but they also make Denisovan research exciting. Every new fossil, every new genetic analysis, every new archaeological discovery has the potential to transform our understanding. The field is developing rapidly. New technologies for extracting and analyzing ancient DNA mean that researchers can now get genetic information from smaller and smaller fragments, from older and older samples. Protein analysis, which works even when DNA is too degraded, is opening up new possibilities for identifying fossils. And new dating techniques are allowing us to place artifacts and fossils in their proper chronological context with increasing precision. There have already been major breakthroughs in just the past few years. The identification of the Shihei jaw through protein analysis, the discovery of Denisovan DNA in sediments, allowing researchers to track their presence even without fossils, the recognition that some fossils previously classified as other species might actually be Denisovan. Each of these advances has expanded our understanding dramatically, and there's good reason to think more discoveries are coming. Fossils that have been sitting in museum collections for decades are being re-examined with new techniques. Archaeologists are searching new sites, guided by genetic evidence that suggests where Denisovans might have lived. Remote regions of Asia that have been little explored are now being surveyed more systematically. It's possible, even likely, that within the next decade we'll find more Denisovan fossils, maybe even a relatively complete skeleton that could finally show us what they really looked like. or tools and artifacts from regions far from Siberia, expanding our understanding of their range and adaptability. But even without new fossils, there's much we can learn from genetics. As more people have their genomes sequenced, we're discovering new fragments of Denisovan DNA, new variants that were retained because they offered some advantage. Each one is a clue to Denisovan biology and the adaptations they evolved. There's also the possibility of studying Denisovan gene function directly. Scientists can now introduce ancient gene variants into cell cultures or even into animals, studying how those genes behave, what proteins they produce, what effects they have. This kind of experimental paleogenetics is still in its early stages, but it offers the potential to understand not just what Denisovan genes were, but what they did. The story of the Denisovans is far from complete. It's still being written with every new discovery, every new analysis, and that's part of what makes it so compelling. We're witnessing the gradual revelation of an entire lost branch of humanity, emerging from obscurity, taking shape before our eyes. A different kind of legacy. As we near the end of our journey tonight, it's worth reflecting on what the Denisovan story means, not just for science, not just for our understanding of human evolution, but for how we think about ourselves and our place in nature. The discovery of Denisovans forces us to confront a fundamental truth. Humanity is more diverse, more complex, and more interconnected than we've typically acknowledged. For most of recorded history, we've thought of ourselves as unique, as separate from other species. We built pyramids and cities and civilizations. We developed writing and mathematics and philosophy. We told ourselves, something special, and in many ways, we are special. Modern humans have accomplished extraordinary things. We've developed technologies that let us survive in every terrestrial environment and even leave Earth entirely. We've created art of stunning beauty and complexity. We've probed the nature of reality at scales from the quantum to the cosmic. But the Denisovans remind us that we're not as special as we thought. Other human species also developed complex technologies. They also created art. They also adapted to challenging environments, solved difficult problems, raised children, and lived rich social lives. They were different from us. Yes, but they were human in all the ways that matter, and we carry their genes, their adaptations, their evolutionary innovations within us. This should change how we think about human nature. We're not a pure lineage. We're a mosaic, a composite, built from the contributions of multiple species. The idea that there's one true human nature, or one correct way to be human, becomes harder to defend when you realize that what we are is partly Denisovan, partly Neanderthal, partly the result of interactions and exchanges among diverse populations. Our diversity isn't just cultural, it's biological, reaching back into deep time, reflecting the diverse evolutionary histories of all the different human species that contributed to who we are today. This also suggests a different way of thinking about extinction. When a species goes extinct, we usually think of it as a complete ending. The final individual dies, and that's it. But the Denisovan extinction, if we can even call it that, was more ambiguous. They disappeared as a distinct population, yes, but their genes survived, their innovations survived. In a sense, they merged with us rather than simply vanishing. This is important because it means the adaptations they evolved, the solutions they developed to environmental challenges over hundreds of thousands of years, weren't lost. They were passed forward, became part of the human toolkit. We benefited from their evolutionary work. And that's a kind of immortality. Not the immortality of being remembered we knew nothing of Denisovans until 2010, but the immortality of contribution, of having shaped the future in lasting, meaningful ways. Think of it this way. Right now, in the Himalayas, a Tibetan shepherd is walking through high mountain passes, breathing thin air, his body maintaining perfect oxygen balance thanks to the EPAS1 gene. That gene was refined by Denisovans over countless generations. It's their legacy, their gift to the present. Or in Papua New Guinea, a Melanesian fisherman is diving into the ocean, his body's metabolism and immune function shaped in part by Denisovan genes. He probably doesn't know anything about Denisovans, but he's carrying their DNA, benefiting from their adaptations. These connections across time are profound. They remind us that we're not isolated in the present, cut off from the past. We're continuations of ancient stories, carriers of ancient wisdom encoded not in books or traditions but in DNA. It also raises questions about responsibility. If we carry the genes of extinct human species, if we're the inheritors of their evolutionary legacy, do we have some obligation to understand them, to honor their contributions? Should museums and research institutions prioritize Denisovan research, work harder to find and study their remains, tell their stories to the public? There's no clear answer, but there's something to be said for gratitude. The Denisovans, without knowing it, helped ensure our survival in harsh environments. They developed adaptations that we still rely on. We owe them something, even if it's just the effort to understand who they were and how they lived. Closing thoughts. Under stars they once knew. And so we come to the end of tonight's journey through deep time, back across the millennia, to a world where multiple human species walked the same ground, breathed the same air, looked up at the same stars we see tonight. The Denisovans are gone now as a distinct people. The last individual who could be called truly Denisovan died tens of thousands of years ago, in some remote corner of Asia, under circumstances we'll never know. But in another sense, they're still here, in the blood of Tibetans adapted to altitude, in the genes of Melanesians, in the archaeology of Denisova Cave. In the questions we ask about human nature and human history, they were more advanced than we initially gave them credit for, advanced in their technology creating jewelry and tools of remarkable sophistication, advanced in their biology, evolving adaptations to extreme environments, advanced in their understanding, surviving and thriving in some of the harshest places on Earth. Were they as advanced as modern humans? That's not quite the right question. They were advanced in their own ways, adapted to their own challenges, living their own version of human life, different but not lesser. Strange kin from a vanished world. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you might imagine that world, a cave in the Altai Mountains, cold and dark, but warm around a fire. A group gathered there, maybe Denisovans, maybe Neanderthals, maybe some of the first modern humans, different faces, different features, but all recognizably human, all thinking, talking, making plans for tomorrow's hunt or next season's migration. Outside the cave, the night is vast and cold, but it's the same night sky we see, the same stars, Orion rising, the Milky Way spreading across the darkness. And under those ancient stars, these ancient people lived their lives, loved their children, told their stories, and passed forward something that still lives in us. Rest now. Let these thoughts drift and settle. The Denisovans are gone, but their story continues in the very fact that we can tell it, that we can wonder about them, that we carry pieces of them inside us, in the genetics of high-altitude adaptation, in the immune responses that protect us from disease, in the mysterious fragments of ancient DNA scattered through modern genomes. The Denisovans endure, silent but present, a hidden current in the river of human history. The questions will still be here tomorrow. The cave will still be there, yielding its secrets slowly to patient researchers. And somewhere in the world, someone is carrying Denisovan DNA, living proof that the past isn't really past, that ancient adaptations still shape the present, that the human family is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. Sleep well, and dream, perhaps, of those other humans who walked this world before us, not strangers, but family, not primitive, but accomplished in their own ways. They lived, they adapted, they survived for hundreds of thousands of years in a world as challenging as any humans have ever faced, and they left us gifts we're only beginning to understand. Thank you for joining this journey tonight, for your patience with the slow unfolding of deep time, for your willingness to wonder about our strange and beautiful human family. The Denisovans are waiting in the past, patient and silent, and now you know their story, or at least as much of it as we can tell today. Tomorrow, there may be more to discover, more fossils, more DNA, more insights into who they were and how they lived. But for now, rest. Let the questions settle. Let the ancient world fade back into the darkness it came from. And know that somewhere in your own DNA, carried forward from ancestors who walked with Denisovans, shared the world with them, learned from them and loved them, there are echoes of that vanished time. You are part of their legacy. We all are. Sleep now and dream of the long ago